Let me, all right, we're good. Okay, I'm gonna get formally started. So thank you all for coming back. I really appreciate it. It's always exciting. I'm happy to have an audience. I want to open on a negative note, which is to apologize, because I thought when I started gearing up to do this lecture, I thought I was going to do it looking at the Sicilian defense. And what I found after probably about 30 minutes of dumping everything I could think of into this Lichess study that I've created was that almost all of my ready examples for the things that I want to talk about came from e4, e5, came from just double king's pawn openings. The good news is that I think that a lot of what we're going to cover applies very much to all the openings and even arguably to both sides. So, you know, I don't think we're going to lose, you know, the appeal to people who are hoping for specifically a Sicilian lecture. But I sort of feel like I misrepresented myself to some people. So I just wanted to publicly acknowledge my my betrayal. Okay, so we're here today to talk about playing black. And one of my friends actually messaged me shortly before this, kind of stunned that this was even a topic, right? She doesn't know a lot about chess, but she was like, aren't they the same? Don't you have all the same things? And my answer to her was yes, right? You do have the entire same team, right? It's 16 on 16. And in fact, an interesting note of history is that up until, let me double check myself here. I know you can't see this entire article, but that is not terribly important to me. But yeah, up until as late as the mid 19th century, black didn't go second.
Huh.
Right? In fact, what would happen is the players would roll dice or choose lots or, you know, some other, you know, rock, paper, scissors for color. And then they would do it again for choice of first move. And so even the famous game called the Immortal Game, right, between Adolf Anderssen and Kieseritzky, a game that I probably will cover at some point, actually was, you know, it's printed in books, if you look at it now, as white moving first. But in reality, in 1851, Anderssen, who played white, or went first, excuse me, was playing black. So kind of an interesting thing, right? That this whole standard of white goes first isn't anywhere near as old as you might think. And actually the checkered nature of the board, right, divided into light squares and dark squares, is also a relatively modern invention. It was just 64 plain squares for probably hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's just kind of an interesting thing. So when we talk about playing black, we really are talking only about a cosmetic difference and the difference of this first move. But this first move can be very significant, right? It means that almost always, all other things being equal, white's punch is going to land first. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about today in terms of, you know, easy mistakes to make while playing black would be, don't be a copycat, right? So I have a couple of different demonstrations of this idea, right? So one of them is simple and one of them is a little more complex. So, you know, we look at, for example, e4, e5, and then knight f3. And the typical response, as you can see, is being recommended by the engine, which I'm going to turn off, is to play knight c6, right? Which is already a little bit of a break in symmetry. But what if, oh, I'm having this problem again. Hang on. So interesting. Sometimes it wants to work for me, and sometimes it really doesn't. So strange. Okay, well, it figures that it works the entire time I'm getting ready, and then, okay, here we go. Finally. Yeah, so what if we play what's known as Petrov's defense, also called the Russian defense, okay, which is to keep things perfectly symmetrical. Now this is, I want to mention as a disclaimer, a perfectly legitimate way to play. Not only is it legitimate, but it's actually grown quite popular in recent years. A young man named Fabiano Caruana, right,
Yep.
who is an Italian-American, I believe he's born in Brooklyn and is currently the #2 ranked player in the world behind Magnus, right? Caruana plays this opening and has played it to great success. So it's not to say that the idea itself is bad. However, it carries a lot of extra complications and it carries a lot of extra difficulties for new players, right? Caruana is a super grandmaster and we are not. So I want to demonstrate why being a copycat can lead to such major problems, right? So if white goes ahead and just snaps the pawn off, right, and black decides to do the same, okay, this thing is being way too finicky. I'm just going to open it up to the whole screen. I don't know why it won't be my friend. Sorry, everybody. One sec. Okay, right. If black decides to try and grab back, okay, white now has this venomous move of queen e2. Okay, now black has a couple of ways to escape from this with only, you know, a lost pawn or so, but I really want to demonstrate the full-on carnage. So let's just say that black goes back, right, tucking his knight back to a safe square. Does anybody see what white does now?
Knight c6.
Yeah, knight to c6. Thank you, Ryan. Right, knight to c6. The queen hits the king. Okay, all right, that's fine. You know, check, no worries, right? Okay, I'll block the check. But of course, the problem is this knight has come to an impossible square and snaps off your queen. Okay, and of course, blocking with the queen is nothing because the knight reaches there too. Very flexible piece, this knight. Notice that taking the knight is impossible because, again, I'm on your king, right? A lot of my students get a little too excited here and they play knight to f7, thinking that it's the same thing. But here, of course, this would be a problem because the king can both save himself and deal with the threat, right? And now you come back to me crying. Sad but true. Okay, so, right, so there's extra dangers involved with being a copycat. Now, in reality, what black should play here is to kick the knight first, right? And then he can go get his pawn back because now queen e2 can be met with queen e7. And we hold on to everything. Okay? All right, a more complex version of the same thing. All right, we take a quick sojourn into chess history. This is a very short game by Jose Raul Capablanca. Who was Jose Raul Capablanca? Well, he was a Cuban chess player. He was a prodigy. So in that respect, he is very much linked with Paul Morphy, right? That he was very, very strong from a very young age and was kind of, what's the best way to describe him? His natural talent was so prodigious that he was kind of known as being a little bit lazy, right? He was not, you know, if you compare him to grandmasters and world champions like Alexander Alekhine, right? And people who were known as being incredibly hard workers, right? Who memorized lots of lines and spent a lot of time. Capablanca was just kind of a natural, right? He would just show up and beat the hell out of you, right? He was an incredible master of the end game, right? This is one of the things that defined his play. And he wrote a book called Chess Fundamentals, okay, which I don't know that I agree with Mikhail Bakhtinnik that it was the best chess book ever written. However, I will say that a 1919 edition of Chess Fundamentals is the first chess book that I ever owned. I found it in the library of my grandmother's house. So Jose Raul Capablanca was probably the first chess player whose name I knew. And you can imagine this made quite an impression, as exotic a name as it is. Okay, so that is Mr. Capablanca. So here is his game where he completely smashes a no-name player. When you see NN, right? It means the player's name is either unknown or they chose to remain anonymous because they got blasted so bad. Okay, so here's the game, right? So we see, okay, certainly black is not going for Petrov's defense, but what we're going to see here, I'm going to breeze through this because we've got a lot to do today, right? But I just want you to notice how much black is making no effort at all to break symmetry, right? At every moment, he just does exactly what white does, okay? And this is a very simple principle. Okay, here's something I just want to point out for a minute. We have this pin, and so white enacts a very typical tactic, which is, okay, if I've got you in a pin, I want to make it worse. So I pile on the pressure, okay? And I add a second attacker. But of course, black still doesn't know that anything is wrong, right? He's doing the exact same thing. And he says, what could be wrong with this, right? I'm playing an equal game against a world champion class player, okay? But after queen d2 and queen d7, this is where we finally see why this kind of strategy is such a fail. Because after, right, bishop f6, bishop f3, Capablanca has this nasty check. And this is the reality of chess, right? Check must always be answered by getting out of check. You cannot continue to just plod along and play the same moves as your opponent. White will hit first. Now, it may not be a check, right? It might be that they grab some more valuable piece of yours, but sooner or later, they're going to make a threat that you can't just copy. Okay, so we notice, of course, to give the queen, right, would seem like a ridiculous amount of sacrifice. So black, not recognizing the danger, plays king to h8, and now, no peeking, there is actually a mating combination already on the board. Anybody think they can find their way through this?
You mean it's forced?
Yeah, every move is forced. It's fairly deep though. We're jumping into the deep end early.
I'm going to guess, Fred, just to throw something out there, bishop to g7 is
okay. So then
at least create a problem.
King must take, of course, right?
Yeah.
So then what?
Well, that's tough.
Not so tough. Bring in the hammer.
I want to get the queen in there.
Yeah, exactly. So
is it queen to g6? No.
G5.
G5.
Yes, queen to G5.
Oh, yeah.
Right, queen to G5.
G5 looks better than g6, yeah.
King has to go back. Okay.
And then queen to
we'll
g7.
put this on board, right? Okay, king has to go back, and now you notice how handy this knight has been because he holds the only escape square.
Mm.
6 is échec et mat, as the French say. Okay, right? Never even had a chance. Look at this, right? All the same pieces, right? The same attack getting ready to go doesn't really matter. Okay. Now, for many of you, this might seem like a simple principle, right? But right. Oh, okay. So don't just literally copy everything he does. But I think the larger point that I'm trying to make with this, the more advanced point, is you have to try and find ways to fight back from the earliest opportunity. You will learn by trial and error when you're being too aggressive, right? Black can be too aggressive and can run into major problems, right, if he neglects development, right? You should always be trying to get castled and get your pieces out. But you have to set problems for white because he is getting there first. And if you just decide to plod along with his version of events, you're going to end up like Mr. No Name.
Right. So whether it's exactly the same attack or not, it's like if it's a 6-move attack and yours is a 6-move attack, his is going to hit first.
Yeah.
So you have to do a faster attack. Or mess up his attack. Yeah.
That's excellent. Thank you. That's exactly it, right? That when you can look at that, that's how to take it to a larger, more general principle, right? How many moves do I need to get there before my threats start being big enough that he has to deal with them? And if the answer is, well, after his does, well, then you need to find a new plan, right? Or going back a couple of weeks to the Spassky game, maybe we need to take some moves off of our attack and deal with his for a second, right? Maybe sometimes you do have to do that. Sometimes it's not passive to stop and address your opponent's plan. Okay, so this is copycatting. This is why not to do it, all right? Moving on to another principle, which is very typical, okay? Which is don't let white have the center to himself. Okay, so we're gonna look at another demonstrative game here, right? Okay, again, we have the typical opening. And after this move, right? So after this bishop c4 move, which I'm a big fan of and I teach to all of my beginner chess players, right? Everybody who comes to me that's below 1,000 rating, I teach them this opening. And the reason is because, number one, of course, it has influence over the center. And number two, because we're going straight for this foolish Freddy, right? A line that we're not going to look at today is the two knights defense, okay? Where if black plays knight to f6, white can already go in for super sharp. I think I pointed this out in an earlier lecture, right? He can just go gunning for that sensitive f-pawn. Okay, and this is a perfectly legitimate opening. It's playable for both sides, but black really needs to know what he's doing or he can get wrecked. Okay, but we're gonna look today at the other reasonable move, which is, okay, to play copycat. Fine, so far, fine, right? We will find our opportunity to break symmetry later. Okay, but what I wanted to just quickly show you is white has still a very aggressive way of continuing to attack in this opening. And I'm going to go ahead and give it away. It is not to play knight to c3, d3, right, bishop to g5, and sort of go for this hyper-symmetrical, everybody's doing the same thing kind of stuff. This can be fine, but I think probably most of you, even as inexperienced as some of you are already sick of these structures, right? And already think, oh, I don't play e5 because you just get this boring game that you get all the time. Well, that's not actually the best way to play chess, in my opinion, right? A better way is to play c3. This is a little bit of an odd move, right? But my idea as white is to aggressively go for the center. Okay, I'm just going to try and take over and give you, as my kids like to say, the snowplow treatment. Okay, so let's see this in action. Let's see it work first so you can see why it's such a problem. Okay, so black does a logical thing at first. This is an excellent move. He develops. Okay, we should definitely be trying to stay active. Here comes d4. We take once. Okay, he takes again. And now we notice our bishop is attacked. So let's say, as many players will do, we just save our bishop and back up. Well, now what you've got is a mobile pawn center. White has complete control, right? You notice that these pawns make a lovely brick wall, and they're mobile. There's nothing impeding them from going forward, right? So another guy I'm really big fan of, this grandmaster named Simon Williams, he calls this the Space Invaders, because those of you who know that game, right, they just kind of, you know, their way down the board, right? So for example, let's say he played, there's a few moves that black could play here, I know, but right, we just kind of keep coming, okay? And eventually what happens, almost no matter what black does, is he ends up, if he goes to the edges of the board, right, you end up with something like this, and the knight is now trapped, okay? And of course, if he tries to go a different way, like, you know, let's say that he plays knight to g8, no, to b8, right? Well, now I can probably castle and maybe even, you know, just keep developing and go for, you know, anything I want, right? I mean, I hope it's clear. I'm not going to play this out to a finish, but this is really bad, you know? Like, the pawns are knocking on your front door, you know, asking if you've heard the good news. This is not what you want. So how do we avoid such things? Well, we got to know about pawn breaks. So I've mentioned a lot of these terms before, right? This just represents me finally dealing with them. So what is a pawn break? Well, a couple of little bits of vocabulary that have helped me immensely when looking at pawn structure, right? What we have here after e4, e5, it's what's called a ram structure. Okay, so called because, like a couple of rams, right, butting heads to show dominance, you've got two pawns that can do nothing but just lock heads and go nowhere. Okay? Ram structures impede the position. The more rams you have on the board, the harder it is to move around. the way to break up rams comes from their neighbors, right? From the levers. If you still have a pawn adjacent either side to your problem ram, right, to the thing you're trying to budge, you can move them up the board and create tension, right? White can play here and, you know, suddenly black takes, and now I've got this beautiful two abreast pawn center that we were talking about, right? It's not directly in the middle, so maybe it's a little bit less strong, but I hope you can see this is still that same kind of effective snowplow kind of a thing, right? Likewise, if black wanted to do it, we can see, right? We could get the same thing going by playing f5 or d5. So for both sides, when you're dealing with a symmetrical structure, like e4, e5, both sides have the same breaks. Both sides are trying to get these moves in. Why? Well, number one, creating open files by taking. You can imagine here for a moment that if I had castled, that my rook would be very happy to see this f pawn go up the board and get exchanged, right? But number two is if I can eliminate this center pawn of my opponent's, I'm going to have an easier time maneuvering and moving around the center. Okay, the f5 and the d5 squares become available to me, and maybe pushing my pawn further up the board, right, to take away some squares from you also becomes an available plan. Okay, so pawn breaks are incredibly important. You have to know what they are for your given structure, and you have to know, more importantly and more laboriously, when to play them, because it is possible to play them too early and get yourself mated. Okay, so just going back to that same position from earlier for a second here, right? We look at the exact same game, but now we're going to look at the established theory. Okay, so again, white says, okay, I'm going to expand with this move c3. Black says, okay, well, I'm not only going to develop, but I'm also choosing a very smart target to attack, right? Notice that the knight c3 move is been taken away from white, so this kind of makes a lot of sense to try and peg on this little weakness here, okay? White obviously could stop and defend, right, and, you know, do this sort of thing, but that's not the plan we're looking at, right? We're looking at aggression and trying to take over. So d4, pawn takes, pawn takes. Does anybody see a better way to save the bishop? Brian, you're disqualified from answering. Just this once.
Well, what about to b4?
Yeah, bishop b4, this is the critical move. This is absolutely critical to the position. Okay, white has a couple of ways to respond here, but I'm just going to look at the most common, the main line. Okay, white plays bishop to d2. Exchanging turns out to be the best move here, so that black doesn't lose even further time, right? Not taking would result in other problems, right? Okay, so he swaps it off. Knight takes to defend the e-pawn. And now here comes the most important move in the entire position, d5. Okay, if white advances, we are more than happy to make this trade. I will make this trade 10 times out of 10, right? To get his dangerous attacking bishop for my knight and eliminating his pawn center, right? You notice, okay, after something like this, I'm not going to be up a pawn, right? He's going to take back, but no snowplow, no sealer sweeper. There's nothing coming for me and my children, okay? Right? If he captures, I can take, and now there's actually one more critically defensive move here. This is pretty cool. I'm going to make you solve this one because it's weird. Brian, I open the floor back up to you. What should black play here? There's only one good move in this position, interestingly. At least in, you know, generally speaking.
Well, there's a knight on c6 to a5. But that's,
So knight to a5, I think actually, maybe I tell a lie. Maybe this is playable, but I think it can get really awkward, right? After something like queen a4, I think this still is really weird, right? I think now black has to play Oh, I guess maybe knight to c6 he's okay. Okay, yeah, but maybe I can come back to b3 and we just end up repeating. Right. So I think, you know what, it has more merit than I realized, but I think there's a better move for black to play that doesn't allow for a draw possibility, right? Maybe I don't want to repeat. Maybe white is a weaker player and I want to beat him. I'm threatening to rip off d5 just so everybody. Right,
I mean, you can move. You move your bishop from ABC to E.
Like this?
Yes, E6. Yes, you could do
So I
that.
was hoping someone would make this mistake. Thank you. Right.
Huge
The
in me.
problem,
You're welcome.
thank you very much. The problem is the departure effect. Right? The problem is the departure effect that we've talked about before. The bishop used to be guarding b7, and now nobody's minding the store. Queen b7, the knight is hit. Okay, the rook is hit, which, of course, I'm not taking the rook yet, but it means you can't do something like queen d7. Right? Whoops, another departure effect problem. Right? And now I think black is in a heap of trouble. Okay, too many pieces are starting to be loose. Okay, even I think knight to a5 here gets met with, I should be able to play, probably this is good enough. Let me think about that a little bit. Do I have something, yeah, maybe queen b5 is even more accurate. I'm not sure. It's a little bit, yeah. I think, you know, now you can't castle, right? I think things can get still a little bit ugly. Okay, I will put you all out of your misery. Unless somebody's got it right this second.
Queen to e7.
Queen to e7. Queen to e7. We hang the knight.
I see. Yeah.
All right. So, oh, I see. But it is check, isn't it? I gotta get out check first. Okay, but maybe I can play. Yeah. Okay. So king to f1, and now I've got this, and I've also got this coming.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. I think we're still not out of the woods. Right. So the answer is a really funny move. That's why I like to talk about it. Right. It's actually knight c to e7 is the move that completely stops all problem. Really weird move, right? Backwards, undeveloping sort of, but it just ends all the pressure. That's the difference between this and the other moves. In other words, I think we discovered it's not that the other moves aren't playable, maybe, right? I think maybe I was being too harsh, but they require a lot more accuracy afterwards. Right? White is still attacking you. This move just kind of puts an end to it. So, okay, so I got enough in the weeds there with everything. The point of this is, right, learning when these critical pawn breaks come in. Okay? Right? Oh, and of course, the final one that I didn't deal with is, what if white just retreats? Well, if white just retreats, I'm very happy to make this trade. Okay, and then castle. And again, I've won the major battle, which is that there's no more big pawn center pushing me around. Okay? I still got to play a game, right? There's a lot of development left to do. I'm not saying our problems are solved, but we've avoided the major issue, right? We have established, look, we have free development for all of our pieces, right? The rooks are going to find good squares. The queen will find a reasonable square. Life is okay. Okay, one nod here to, all these games are starting at the end and giving the fun away. One nod to the Sicilian defense here, right? I just wanted to note that white can try this same plan. This is what's known as the Alapin or the C3 Sicilian, right? The C3 being a much simpler name for it. The C3 Sicilian. White's trying to do the exact same thing, right? Play D4, swap for your C pawn, and get a big pawn center. Now, there's lots of ways for black to respond here, but Neil, what do you think might be a thematic way, given what we just learned? I know, I'm putting you on the spot.
D6.
Sorry?
Pawn
D6?
to- Yeah.
D6 probably playable, right? But let's be even more dramatic about it. We can go ahead and play D5,
Okay.
right? We can go for this pawn break right away. Interestingly. Now, why is that possible? Well, the major thing that makes this okay is we notice after we take back, white doesn't have that knight move that he usually has to pop us with, right? We're not losing time with our queen, right? So I just wanted to give you something there, right? At least there's one knot. Another good move here is actually knight f6, provoking the pawn to come forward, right? And then the knight finds safety on d5. But I find that a little bit less clear for today's lecture, right? Sometimes you can get this move in right away. And in fact, that is the idea behind, just 1 second here. The Scandinavian, okay, or the center counter defense seeks to make this move right away. It says, why can't, okay, if pawn breaks are so good, let's just go, right? The reason this is a little bit less respected is because, right, if white has this option, okay, we're losing a little bit of time. So we've avoided the big pawn center chasing us around. That's good. This is a playable opening, but we've sacrificed something else, which is now we've lost a little bit of development time, right? Where queen's gonna have to move again. And actually one of my favorite ways, so queen to a5 is the main move here. One of my favorite ways for black to get embarrassed is to just play queen to c6. And anybody wanna have the fun here? White to play and win? Sorry?
Bishop b5.
Yeah, bishop b5, just instant, right? Death. Knight defends bishop. Whoops. Right? So, you know, this d5 move, you have to evaluate it carefully. I guess I wanted to show you at least one negative example. Okay?
John, can I ask a quick question?
You may.
To the earlier point about white having the first move, black begins the game a tempo off because it has to respond to the move. So
Yes.
it seems to me it's sort of incumbent upon black not to make that any worse in terms of, I mean, a goal presumably is to avoid getting too far down in terms of white's advantage, right? So
Yes.
it's a good thing to avoid moves that just exacerbate your problem.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I actually am going to deal with that a little bit later on. This lecture is probably a little over full, but I guess they all have been. But yes, we are going to talk about, right, as you can probably see now, because I'm sharing the whole thing, right? I have don't waste time as, you know, I have I think I have 3 different example games in here. We're gonna see if we can't get through all of them. Okay, so I wanted to show this game. I'm gonna be relatively quick through this game. I'm gonna do a little bit less of examining every single move than I sometimes do, right? What I want you to pay attention to, I will slow down where I think we're learning, you know, today's lesson, right? So this is my game, as you can probably see down the bottom of the screen there. I was playing a 1900 player, I think, right? Maybe high 1800s in a tournament. And this is back when I used to play e5. And we're going to see something, right? So white went for this kind of symmetrical, you know, boring, keep things safe kind of structure with d3, right? He's not going for the sharp stuff. He's not going for the big center stuff. He just wants to put his pieces out and play chess. A perfectly reasonable thing to do. But what I want you to notice is how I put this active pawn break plan into use, okay, and create a much more interesting and active game than you might be used to seeing from these structures. Okay, so I actually, bishop c5, I'm sure, is a major move here. I'm actually a huge fan of this move, bishop e7. This is the kind of thing that all of my students go with an attitude in their voice. What does that do? Right? Well, it develops, right? It covers my king very nicely so that if the e file ever comes open, I'm not getting checked, right? And I'm safely ready to castle next turn. But the other reason I like it is purely practical, which is especially playing against a kid, right? This was a younger player. I like to take the typical ideas away. I know we looked at this earlier, right? We saw it in the Capablanca game. Okay, we had these ideas about as soon as you're out of the opening, I pin your knight to your queen, and then I come in with knight to d5, right? And I just make you miserable, okay? And there's obviously ways for black to play around this, okay? But I didn't feel like it. I don't particularly like letting my opponent have his main ideas, okay? So I like to just play bishop e7 because now this move has no teeth. There's no pin. Right? It's just a bishop. It's just sitting there. Okay. And in fact, sometimes I can even enact traps on it, right? If he moves the knight later, and has a loose piece on g5, right? Maybe I can get a discovered attack or something. Okay, now that doesn't end up happening in this game, but I just wanted to explain why I'm not doing the usual thing. Okay, so my opponent plays c3. He's going to gradually build up in the center. Okay, he just decided to do it a slower way. I castle. Okay, now I think I actually waste time here. I should have just gone for my plan right away. So this is, you know, an inaccuracy on my part. But yeah, so excuse me about that. Right, so right, he builds up, right, he's sort of going for this slow kingside pawn roller, right? He just wants to gain a bunch of space, but you notice white is kind of expecting that I'm just going to behave myself, right? I mean, he's made an awful lot of moves, right, for just his pawns and not really been developing his pieces, okay? Whereas I spent my turns developing my 2 knights. I notice I did say even this was a waste of time, right? That on my part, I don't need to actually slow this down, as it turns out. I was being a little too cautious. Okay, but I got castled, I got my pieces developed, everybody's basically ready to go. So here comes our thematic move, d5. Okay, pawn takes, knight takes. And now what we see is, first of all, there's no snowplow going to be coming my way, right? My bishops both have diagonals that they can start to use. And development is going to be very easy for me, right? So he castles, I play bishop g4. Okay, mostly because one of the major flaws in the way that I played, right, something that I do have to note, is that this e-pawn is a little bit of a target, right? I mean, it's on an open file, okay? And guarding it with something like f6, I hope we can all see that that makes things awfully tender, right? I can end up in a lot of trouble on that light square diagonal if I open that up. So I do have to make sure that I'm taking care of this liability, right? So he, you know, puts the question to my bishop. I decide I don't want to take. He puts the question to my bishop again, okay, and shuts me out. And now he's got the pressure that he wanted on the e5 pawn, okay? But already I can manage to defend against some of his threats with tactics, okay? Because my pieces are active, I'm getting an interesting game, right? Knight b6, and my idea was, does anybody see what happens now if he tries to, this is getting, you know. What happens if he tries to steal my pawn right now? Anybody see
You
it?
take back with the knight.
Okay, I take back with the knight. He takes with the rook. Still up a pawn.
Well, if you take his knight with your, I mean his bishop with your knight, and he either, if he doesn't capture back, he'll lose his queen. I mean, if he captures back, he'll lose his queen.
Exactly. Right. So this is my idea behind knight b6. Right. Knight b6, and hey man, if you want that pawn, come and get it. Right. Spoiler alert. He's good enough. He saw through that. Right. But the exchange, and then whoops, you get a pawn, I get a piece. How about that? Okay. And oh, by the way, those of you who are clever and argumentative might have noticed, right? He can try and maybe sacrifice here, right? And then no more pin. He can take my knight. But I think, let me just see. I think that I had some nastiness here that suddenly I'm, well, I guess, yeah, just rook a to d8. And now I think the impression that I want to make on you so that we can keep moving is just, you can see how that's not really where you want your pieces to be, right? White is really kind of pathetically behind in development, and there isn't much of a great way to deal with it. I mean, if he moves the queen off in any way, then here I come, okay, and you know, here I come, and yeah, this is just getting really ugly, okay? Really, really sad king all to his lonesome. But if he covers, I think probably I can still, yeah, right? I still come in with all of my attackers and make him quite miserable, okay? All right. So I think in the name of keeping things efficient, we're just going to look as far as that, right? Just to show you how you can get an active game. I guess maybe a couple more moves would be, right? He played knight b to d2. I took here anyway. And I would have, I think I played e4 here, which isn't bad, but I would have gotten really active play by playing f5. Okay, when your pawn is in the center, get him a buddy. And we can see the rook is coming open. Okay, again, my bishops are getting ready to be very active. And this would be, you know, probably minus plus, as they say, right? Very, very strong advantage for black. All right, I went on to win this game, but a little bit slower. Okay, so this is the idea behind playing your pawn breaks. Chapter 2. What's even nicer than playing your pawn breaks is when you can just eliminate the guy's center pawn completely. Okay, so for example, right, when to trade pawns and when not to trade pawns. Well, one of the things that I would say is when your opponent has a pawn in the center and you can take it off without their recapturing with a pawn, right? In other words, a simpler way to say that is when you can get rid of one of your opponent's center pawns, you should do it. Okay, so for example, in the Scotch game, as you can see, the strongest response for black here, if he just goes for the center right away, is to take the pawn. Okay, and then not to just keep capturing, right, and get trade happy, but instead, knight f6 is certainly a good move, but I also really like just develop, right, and try and hit at this vulnerable knight in the center. Black has actually a really cool trick here where if white swaps off the knight, we can obviously take back right away and that's fine, but I really like throwing in this move, queen to f6. Okay, where the knight's still there, but if he tries to save himself in any way, that is a terrible arrow, right? Checkmate. Okay, so active play, right? Getting rid of the center pawns and then using the newly created target. Notice I can't just play bishop c5 right now. That's the problem with center pawns. They impede development. They impede progress, okay? An even more forceful way to get rid of a center pawn, okay, is to use the center fork trick. Now, you need some cooperation from white here, granted. But, okay, let's say that we're going into this super symmetrical four knights thing. Okay, the main move now for white is to play bishop b5, and this is a good move and leads to, you know, another sort of game. But what I frequently find that people do is they kind of mix up their openings, right? They don't think it makes any difference, and they play this bishop c4 move. Well, this isn't a good move. And we looked at this trick in a previous lecture, okay? Black now has the dirty, rotten trick of playing knight to e4, where if white recaptures, what do I got?
d5.
d5. There's that thematic move again, right? We get rid of the center pawn, and as a result, we take over the center. But okay, I'm going to look at two different lines in this trick because it's important to understand it thoroughly if you're going to use it at all. So the first one is, well, all right, John, but like, let's say that white knows exactly what he's doing and he saves the bishop. Remember I said earlier, the bishop is a very dangerous attacking piece. Okay, and black takes and white takes. So what? Well, I'll tell you so what. The so what here is that number one, don't underestimate the psychological value of knocking white back on his heels, right? This goes back to the do play aggressively, right? Do look for opportunities to take the fight to them, okay? If you make them uncomfortable, they get rattled. And you don't want white to play comfortable because he's already ahead of you. So that's the first thing. The number of times I have watched when my kids, who all know this trick, right? I am relentless about this trick. When they pull this off on somebody, the number of times the kid just makes a complete blunder on the very next move because he is shook. It happens all the time, okay? But there's something more important that you can use against the more even-keeled, which is that there's no center pawn. White does not have a pawn in the center. And just one thematic tactic here to demonstrate why that could be such an issue. So first of all, white is threatening maybe at some point or soon to take the knight and then take on e5, right? So very first thing, I develop and I put my bishop on a lousy diagonal, but I defend my weakness, okay? Let's say white castles and I castle, okay? And now let's say they play the completely innocuous d3. They cannot possibly see why d3 could be so bad. Okay, I mean, for one thing, I just want to mention, I'm pretty sure that d4 can also get you into a heap of trouble here, potentially. I think white probably has a way to play it carefully, but if, for example, he were to go for this, okay, this is always one of my favorite tricks to watch out for.
Mhm.
What can black play now?
Bishop captures on h2.
So we notice that the queen is loose on d4. Give people a second, Brian. Right? The queen is loose on d4. So the bishop takes and oh no, right? You got to answer the call. Okay. So d4 would also be disaster, but I want to look at this d3 move. More importantly, black has a dirty, rotten trick, which is to play knight to e7. And I'll tell you why I'm playing this. Number one, I'm playing it to control this square against any bishop check. And number two, I'm playing it to prevent the bishop from being able to trade itself on c6. Okay, so let me show you exactly what I'm up to. All right. White plays another normal looking move. Anyone but Brian. What is black to play and win material? Think thematic. Think about, he doesn't have a center pawn. What do I want to do?
F5.
F5. F5. Trapping the bishop. Whoops. Right? No bishop check to save you. No swap on c6 to save you. Okay, this knight e7 move, we've seen this twice actually today. That was, I can't pretend that was on purpose, right? But sometimes these little maneuvers, very sneaky. But again, the part I want you to remember is that it comes from eliminating white's influence in the center. And that gives my pieces a chance to make their own influence felt. Okay. All right. So that's one line, right? Even if he doesn't fall for this immediate trick, we have good, I'm trying to think what white has to play now, I guess, to avoid it, right? Yeah, I think, I guess d4 is necessary, but even here, f5 is a very strong move. Oh, and in fact, you know what? Look at that, right? Bishop d3, e4. Whoops, I still am still coming and kicking your butt, right? I guess white can sort of escape here, but I think things are still very awkward, right? I'm still in the driver's seat. Even if there are things where white is managing not to be material down yet, I hope it's clear to at least some of you that I'm still very happy with the way this is going as black, right? I'm in charge of the game. Look at me, look at me. I am playing white now. Okay. Cool. All right, so that's one line, right? But let's look at this other line. This is one of my prouder games, I have to say. Okay, so this game, the one thing I want to say about it before we start is, this wasn't anybody particular. I think he was rated around 2,000, but it was a rapid play game. So it was 30 minutes each side. And rapid play is not as wild and loose as Blitz, but it does lend itself to kind of wild attacks, right? And, people typically try things that are more aggressive than they would in a game that's going to last 5 hours, right? If your opponent has not so much time to think about it, attacks that are a little bit more suspect become better, right? So I don't think that this guy's attempt was so wrong-headed. It just happened that I was completely prepared because I had an interest, okay? So let's look at it. So here's the game, right? And here's this knight c3 move, and we notice, okay, I've got my setup. Oh, one quick thing here. You definitely never, ever want to play the center fork trick when you have developed your bishop to c5, because white plays here and you go, ha-ha, d5, and he takes another piece. And you are lost. and you curse me, and I have nothing for you. Okay? This whole thing does not work if you don't remember the exact moves that are happening. Okay? Anybody who wants can have the link to this lecture afterwards. If you're like, what was that again? How did it work? Okay? So here we are. My bishop is not developed. That's why it's not developed, right? That's why I play this, is to hopefully get this possibility. And I play knight takes e4. And I think I made reference to this in a previous lecture. White now plays bishop f7 check. Now, obviously I take the piece, right? We don't have to talk about that. But what I do want to talk about here is that I got into an argument at city championships in New York with a chess player's father, who is himself an amateur chess player. It was reasonably civil, right? And the guy's a very nice guy, but he kind of refused to believe that this could possibly be good for black, right? He was convinced that this was a bad way to play, and that he couldn't believe I was teaching the students to do this and all of this kind of thing. And I do understand his reluctance, right? I mean, the king is so exposed. So maybe you're all with me and on my team already, but to help allay some of those concerns, I want to point out a couple of reasons why I am incredibly happy with this position and I am going to steamroll him. Okay? Number one, he has no pawn center. His pawn center is gone. Number two, my weaknesses with the king on the traditional diagonal are gone. There is no bishop to take advantage of them. Now, certainly the queen could be an issue, but the queen is not developed yet. And it's going to take at least one more move before she has the means to get developed. Okay? I am doing very well. Now, I have lost this position in blitz games many a time. Okay? Something like 3-minute or 5-minute. But that's what I mean, right? As we talked about before, like hack attacks become more valuable if your opponent is short on time. And a lot of the time I didn't lose because of the opening. I lost because I got flagged, or some other dumb thing happened, right? That's not really the fault of the opening. But this is why I became so obsessed with this, because it's kind of a thing with me. I'm a little too principled. When people play junk openings against me, I become obsessed with knowing every last detail of refuting them. I don't mind losing. I hate to lose to junk. Okay? What move must black play right now? Speak up.
D5.
D5.
Yeah.
Give me that center. Give me that center. Okay, he comes in and checks me, right? This is why everybody's convinced that white's still in the driver's seat. Okay, that's perfectly fine. I'm going to tuck my king on G8. Notice how this D5 pawn does a great job of temporarily shielding me from any problems on this diagonal. Okay, not going to happen. All right, and this knight, the scariest part of the whole equation, well, you'll see how I deal with him in a moment. Okay, so the strongest response here, I think, is for white to play D4 and at least get some kind of pawn center. Even then, black is doing very well. But in the game, my opponent played D3. Okay, H6, go away with your knight. No free parking. Knight comes back to H3. Okay. Development. Pinning the knight to make sure that I don't have to deal with any pressure here. Okay. And, creating more difficulties with him with trying to get his pieces out. Okay. He admittedly plays a really bad move. Queen D2 is just not very good. Probably better was to play C3 and try and sort of slow roll the center. But, he plays queen to D2 to try and get out of the pin. It's understandable. Okay. But now, right, I exchange off this knight to double his pawns. And I get my queen into a good square with tempo. Okay. This knight has to be dealt with. The knight has no forward motion available. Someday later, we will talk about the best way to control knights. And I will tell you that you must control a knight's forward squares before you start attacking it. Knights will not go backwards unless you make them go backwards. Right? So notice that I have to carefully consider these squares before I start trying to give them the old heave-ho. Okay? Yeah, that's a move everybody's excited to play, right? Yeah, I put my knight back on G1 and separate my king and rook. Okay? bishop to c5, keeping him honest, right? If he wants to leave, I've got checkmate threats. Okay, c3. I think probably there were slightly more accurate ways to play in here, but this worked out fine for me. I didn't want to let him push me around at all. So I played a5, right, just to stop these pawns from coming forward. And I actually had another goal in mind. So he plays a3, and now I play a4 and tamp down on this square. Okay, this part's getting a little bit more advanced, so why I'm going to breeze through it, right, so we can get to the stuff that's very clear. Okay, he plays h3 to try and give his rook some maneuverability. Okay, and now we see knight to a5. Trying to use this square that I dug out for myself, right, to get into his guts. Okay, he deals with that, obviously, right? I play it anyway. Gets my knight developed and into a good square. Oh, important to note here. Okay, so, right, it maybe looks like he can steal a pawn here and start getting into the driver's seat. Does anybody want to hazard a guess why he can't do that?
Well, you could start with queen f2. Queen
Yeah, I can still go back here and take me. and he's getting mated, right? So there's a lot of reasons why you can leave pawns up for grabs, right? I prefer as much as possible, rather than defending them, I would much rather give him an opportunity to make a bad move. Okay, so he just plays rook to b1, right, defending his rook. Yeah, I guess that's another reason, right? You can't do it yet. Okay, king to h7. Now I'm planning to answer not only with queen to f2 is very good, but I also have the idea, whoop, not you. I also have the idea after queen e5 of pinning and winning. Okay, so that's not a thing he's going to want to get up to. Okay, king to f1 to prevent that idea. I develop my pieces. Okay, and now here is a very interesting moment. So I had a conversation with Brian Curry. Just, what was it, yesterday?
Yep.
Yeah, what time is no meaning. Okay, so I put this up on Instagram as one of the like little simple puzzles that I think is very good here. So Brian, you're gonna take over when we get to Brian has contributed to this lecture. He has to be given co-author status today because what he, you take your credit. He pointed something out that I did not notice at the time I played this game. And actually, I don't think I noticed in the post-game analysis, right? I've had this game kicking around for years and have used it to teach a few times. And I just never really noticed something that's pretty good. It's a pretty good defensive tactic. But before we get into that, so what I want you to notice here, one of my future lectures is going to be on double attacks. So what I want to point out here is White has one of the seeds of tactical destruction, okay, which is that he's got a loose piece on h2. This rook is not defended. And he's got a barely defended piece, right? He's got this loose piece on b1, but what I'm more concerned with is the barely defended piece on c1. Now, what is barely defended? Barely defended is defined as a piece that is attacked exactly as many times as it is defended. Okay, even if the piece is defended 3 times and is as safe as Fort Knox, if it's also attacked 3 times, that means it is mathematically a loose piece. Okay, so they're harder to spot. And most of the difficult tactics that my students work on that they have a lot of trouble with have to do with noticing not loose pieces. They're all very good at that, but the barely defended pieces. So why does it matter? Okay, well, can anybody see how this is a 2-move combination? I can set up a weakness and then use my queen to exploit it. So the second move is a queen move. I'm trying to give you as much as I can without giving it away altogether. Does anybody see the maneuver here? Besides Brian, who we will get back to. Sometimes you got to let a silence fall. First move's a capture. Maybe that'll help.
You attack the bishop with your knight.
Knight takes c1. Okay, with the idea that if rook takes back, Bill.
I mean, I'm not happy, but let's see. I don't have a plan after that.
Anybody else?
Queen to c4.
Queen to f4. Yes,
Yeah.
I know. I knew what you meant. I knew what you meant. Right, queen to f4. So this is the game continuation, right? And this is the rest of the game is pretty academic, right? I mean, I pick up a rook, right? And then, right, oh yeah, right, excuse me. And then he tries to steal the pawn, and I have yet another tactic to defend, which is that I play bishop to d6, and I'm going to pick up another exchange.
Brutal.
Yeah, he started playing angry after he lost the rook, right? He was on tilt at that point. So, you know, it happens to all of us, right? I've played plenty of ugly games. I just don't tend to include them in my lectures. Well, except for that one queen h5 one that we did, right? But yeah, the rest of this, I don't think we need to talk about too much, right? I made some judicial sacrifices to get the pieces off because at the end, right, he finally resigned here. He's got a whole slew of pawns, but the rook is just too good. And actually, at least one of these pawns is going to fall off as well, right? If these pawns were further up the board, I could actually have really blown it here, right? You could really get into a lot of trouble. The rook is not always fast enough to deal with a pawn mass that's threatening to queen. But here, it's no trouble at all. But that's not the interesting part. That's not the interesting part. Brian pointed out to me the other day via the interwebs that after knight c1, what could white play, Brian?
Queen c2, lining the queen up with the king, and still attacking the knight, and also threatening the discovery to take the bishop.
So the knight is attacked twice. If the knight just returns, okay, we've got a follow-up idea, which is that pawn to d4 wins his piece back. Oh no! My beautiful game, I thought. Right? He'd spoiled this thing for me. It turned out I wasn't good. I was just lucky. Well, as it turned out, it's a little of both, right? I was lucky because I would have had to solve this over the board, and it would have taken some thinking, and it was rapid play, right? We can understand why my opponent missed it. Not because I don't think he's strong enough, but probably more because of time, right? And maybe frustration, right? We can get into a bad mental space. Okay, but what's interesting is that actually black is still winning. So the first move, right, we play queen f4 anyway, which Brian also contributed, right? Guarding the knight, but you know, the knight's attacked twice, so that's less important, right? What's more important is that I'm pegging on this rook, okay, and gaining time. Then knight to g2, okay? Knight back to b3, saving my piece, okay? I am now a clean piece up. Here comes the awful discovered attack. This is really kind of out there. This forgive me, those of you who are now, you know, your eyes are spinning. Okay, queen f5. Notice you still don't have time to take the bishop. Okay, fine, right? I'll trade and take, except whoopsie daisies. At the end of everything, I've got knight to d2, and I still end up material. Okay, something like this. Okay, and for now, I'm up a whole rook. It's possible that the knight could get trapped, right? But even in that situation, I'll still be up the exchange. Okay, so this was still winning for black, but holy cow, was it more complicated than I realized. So thank you very much, Brian, because that was very interesting. It gave me a new look at something that I definitely thought I knew everything about. Okay, it's 1:43. I think, you know, we're riding. I mean, we start 5 minutes late every time, but I think that's probably plenty for one day. I recognize you could just as easily have ended up calling this lecture the Pawn Center rather than being about black, but I still think it applies because, as I said before, just like white usually is the first one to have a mating attack or something else, white is also going to be the first one to grab the center if you let him, right? White is going to be ahead on all these plans. So most of the time, black has to look at it as, how do I react and stop that, rather than, well, how do I just grab the center, right? That's not really your role, unless you're playing somebody who, you know, doesn't know what they're doing, or you know, doesn't adhere to that strategy. Any questions about today, or anything else, actually, for that matter?
I guess my problem would be, as a regressed player, I actually played more billions of years ago, and it's amazing what I don't know anymore. But my problem would be, in these circumstances, playing black, you afford me seemingly an opportunity. I'm sort of thinking, oh, well, no, I need to, rather than discomfort you, I need to make sure I develop my pieces. So there's a tension in my mind between, you know, getting out of my mindset. So shifting a mental plan is very difficult, would be very difficult for me in that circumstance.
Yeah, I think, you know, the thing you got to think about, though, is, can it be both?
I'm
You
sure
know,
it can, but
like in general here, right? Without ignoring the specificity of the center fork trick for a second, right? That's the point that I want to make to you is, until or unless you know something specific, right? If you get a trick from a book, if you get an opening from a teacher, right, this sort of thing, then by all means, you can ignore where it breaks principle, right? No, like so-and-so told me this is okay to break principle because of such and such. But otherwise, I would say that, you know, everything I'm doing is actually very principled, right? You notice that these, aside from maybe the center fork trick itself, right? And even this is about development, right? Like I don't try and win the pawn. The object of this is not to win the pawn. It's to get rid of the pawn. It's to swap it off, right? He ends up getting his pawn back if he plays properly, you know? Right? There's no loss of material. It's just that he has an extra pawn back on the bench, whereas I have an extra pawn ready to come into the game. You see what I mean? It's like, I don't want you to think of them as being at odds with each other, right? You should always be trying to be annoying and be developing. If your move only does one good thing, it's probably not good enough. And we'll talk about that. I'm planning on doing double attacks next week. Although I am still very open to suggestions, right? If people have something they're passionately concerned with. But, you know, something that we look at with double attacks is, if you're not setting at least 2 problems all the time, you're not setting enough problems. You know, you're giving your opponent his one turn to deal with your one problem. You're never going to get ahead that way, right? So you want to be developing and setting problems, and taking over the center, and, you know, blah, 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 blah. When you have 4 or 5 things that you can say are good about your move, right, you can have some faith that it's probably good, you know? It would be a hyper-specific situation for that to not be right, right? For that to, well, turns out there's this, you know, attack, and oops, you know? And then you learn that exception, and that's fine. You know, you move forward.
thank you.
Anybody else? Anything at all? I mean, you're also welcome to all, you know, feel like that was more than enough.
Thank you very much. It was very good.
John, question for you. Do you suggest I got an account on Lichess, and if you go to the learn section, right?
Yeah.
They have, like, there's just, you know, puzzles there.
Yeah.
I've played around with. Like,
Yeah.
is it worth just spending time in that section to kind of
Yeah.
figure things
Yeah,
out?
I think it's great. I think it can be nice. Something like, you know what's a pretty good book, actually? Sometimes it can be nice, Kenny. You don't have to, especially with the way that things are taking so incredibly long to ship. Although
Yeah.
there might be a Kindle version of this, which would at least help. I don't know if that's, you know, a
Yeah.
thing you have access to, though. But something like this can be, although I will say I have a Kindle reader on my computer, so, you know.
Oh, cool.
I just, right, you don't have to own the dumb device. But something like this can be really useful as a way to help you understand 2 things, right? Number one, to help you understand categories
Mm-hmm.
of tactics, which can, you know, look, that isn't necessarily a thing that I'm doing during a game, but it can be helpful to kind of wrap your mind around what's happening.
Absolutely.
And also, the one thing that I don't like about the generalized tactics trainers on chess.com and Lichess is that, although I think they may have changed this now, what I would say is doing tactics based on theme can be really helpful, right? To, you know, you think of it like, I don't know, finger exercises for guitar or something. Like,
Yeah.
you want to do the same exercise over and over until you've mastered that exercise, and or at least gotten pretty good at it, and then move on, right? If you're constantly solving tactics from all the different categories,
It doesn't
it's
have-
more,
yeah.
yeah, it's more like actually playing. That has a role, but you might not want that right at the beginning. You might want to know, just like, wait, like, can I just have an idea and learn to spot that idea? Because
Yeah.
a lot of the time, as we talked about with your, you say it was your brother? I can't remember.
Uh-huh.
A lot of the time, just having one idea can be enough. You know, if the other guy's consistently leaving it out there, like, that's it. You win a piece, and now you're just up a piece.
Yeah. I
So
had a-
that's, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was something that we were, you know, you talked about like going on tilt and stuff. My brother had somehow maneuvered kind of this pawn wall down, but he's in the same boat I am, where there was really no end game that he had kind of played, and I thought I was out. I was thinking of resigning, and I think it was like a puzzle in play where I ended up winning, and I somehow got around. He like missed a checkmate that was there, and then I took over from there. But it was.
Yeah.
That kind of came from the puzzles of being like, what is the one move that can save you here? You know?
That's great. Do you played this online?
I did, yeah.
Send it to me.
Okay, I'll see if I played it on chess.com, but I'll send it to you and see what.
Yeah, I'm on chess.com as well, you know, so whatever.
Cool.
I have actually the same username on both too, so
Oh,
that's easy.
great,
But
great,
I love
great.
to see games. You know, it's interesting, and it helps me, especially if you're going to keep attending lectures.
Yeah,
It's helpful to me to see what people are dealing with. You know, I want to speak directly to the people.
absolutely.
Okay. Well, I think we'll wrap it there. Again, if anybody has something else they come up with afterwards, you know, shoot it to me in a private message.
Thank you.
But thank you all so much for coming. I hope you'll keep coming out. Please do enlist your friends. You know, I love that some of you guys have been really loyal, and I really appreciate that. We've got probably 3 or 4 more of these. I probably won't continue past June. But I'd love to get as many people as we can in before then.
Cool.
You know, so thanks again. Thank you all so
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.